we are all worse off as a result of this pandemic. This is not like the financial crisis. Obviously, in the financial crisis, some scars were left. In this case, there are probably different types of scars and long lasting in terms of the economies, both of the advanced countries and the emerging markets. I would say, I would make a couple of points. One, the pandemic, any disturbance, economic disturbance, health disturbance is going to produce, in effect, winners and losers. However, if we think about the pandemic as a one-time crisis, hopefully, it's important to distinguish between changes that were already underway, in other words, structural changes, and the cyclical changes, if you will, that were engendered by the pandemic. And so when we think about industries and countries, how have they been affected as we hopefully come out of this? One of the obvious changes is the way that people work and the way that the services industries are going to be structured going forward. And when you think about shopping, as we all know, going to a store now to buy certain things, not all things, you might well just do this by your desk and wait for a company to deliver the goods. So there's differences, ways in work. The question, though, is, how will certain people of different incomes be able to do that? How much access do they have to the services infrastructure? Will they be the ones that need to go to the stores, for instance, or go to the factories? I think the other question is, when you think about structural changes that were already underway, think about artificial intelligence and digitalization. And so when we think about the logistics industry, or the shipping industry, there were already changes in the works, except for delivery of certain goods at the last mile, where shipping and logistics was already becoming digitalized and more animated, if you will. And that is a trend that is going to be accelerated as a result of the pandemic. When we think in terms of the countries, the advanced countries, particularly because they have more resilient health systems and more resilient economies, they're certainly coming out of this, at least according to the latest forecasts. They're beginning to rebound, obviously. Whether that rebound will be permanent and lasting in terms of robust growth for several years to come, I think is an open question. And that brings me to the other part of the world, the emerging markets and the poor countries, which I think are decidedly much worse off, both for the mortality issues that Angel raises that we're already concerned about and knowledgeable of, but how will they begin to restructure their workplaces? How will they begin to restructure how they trade with not just each other, but with other countries of the world? And I think net, I think populations in the emerging markets will be much worse off as a result of the pandemic. I do think that we need to emphasize that this is a work in progress, that yes, we appear to be coming out of the pandemic, but I think it's really quite premature for those of us who are on the front lines, at least thinking about this from an economics perspective, to believe that it's over. It may be over for the wealthy countries, but it's certainly not over for the vast population of the planet. And to the extent that those other countries are not vaccinated, there is not sufficient herd immunity within the countries, the emerging markets, that means that all of us around the world are not going to enjoy any kind of herd immunity if we believe that the globalized economy is here to stay, which I think it is. But it does raise the question about whether or not there will be a splitting, if you will, a decoupling from the advanced countries and the emerging markets in terms of economic growth. For the last 2 decades, the GDP growth, rate of GDP growth, real terms in emerging markets really was about twice the rate of GDP growth in real terms of the advanced economies, regardless of the business cycle. That is shown in the data very clearly. I think now the question before us is whether there's going to be a structural shift in that, whether or not growth in emerging markets, put aside China, I'm talking about the other emerging markets, and put aside India, whether or not their growth will be downgraded significantly, and whether there will be a structural split between the poor and the wealthy countries. So those, I think, when I think about the winners and the losers, so to speak, of the pandemic, that's the way I think about things. And I think it's really a decidedly mixed picture, and we are not out of the woods yet by a long stretch in my view. You know, it's very interesting about the supply chain, because I not only was a private equity investor in companies that engage in shipping and logistics and supply chain management, but now I'm an advisor to them and deal with investment disputes around them, was that many people in industry, even very senior people in industry, when China went offline because of the pandemic and sort of the world shut down for a moment, and that's being optimistic, all of a sudden executives were finding out that, you know, it's not just a question of the supply chain running, you know, bilaterally, if you will, between China, let's say, and the United States. Rather, what happened over the last 2 or 3 decades is supply chains have become extraordinarily complex and tiered, so that a product that, you know, might have a label made in China on it that comes to US shores, you know, some component, maybe a basic component, is manufactured in China. That then is shipped over to, let's say, Thailand, where an additional component is put on it, more value added, and then it gets shipped maybe to Brazil, where there's more of a finishing of the product, and then it comes to the United States. And so when China went offline, all of a sudden many firms recognized that it's not just because China went offline, but because they were maybe the producer of the first link in that chain, and they realized, oh my God, the supply chains are extraordinarily complex. People in middle management and people who are, you know, working the ropes, they understood this. So I think that has really been an eye-opener for much of industry today. And I think when you combine this issue, which I raised and Anshul also echoed, with the digitalization, I think it really means that supply chains, in order to become more resilient from shocks, whether it's a health shock, whether it's a pure economic shock, whether it's a natural disaster, I think people are beginning to rethink, how can we make these supply chains more resilient? And one of the things that's beginning to happen is adding redundancy into supply chains. It's almost like when a power plant goes offline, you have spare capacity to take care of peak problems. I think what we are beginning to see now in industry is investment in second tier, other types of ways of supplying into the supply chain from places that you might not have ordinarily have thought of as being part of the supply chain. I think with respect to inflation, you know, there's a raging debate here, as many people may know, about whether or not inflation, at least in the United States, where I'm sitting, is going to be a significant problem. Now, I think a lot of people have been surprised at how much pent-up demand there was for products, for services, and as a result of some policy mixes, people are at record levels applying for new jobs and leaving other jobs. But I think what also has been misunderstood is that although there is a rise in prices now, this is a natural part of macroeconomic resiliency. Of you get a blip in demand, but then it settles down to its more stable state. And so, for instance, there was a really interesting article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday or the day before about where lumber prices have gone through the roof from, you know, Home Depot and other package stores for building supplies, and people began to buy excess amount of lumber thinking that they could then resell it by making a profit. All of a sudden, they're realizing that there's excess supply of lumber out there, and lumber prices now are beginning to decline. So I think there is very much an open question about whether these tendencies will result in a stable state of inflation. Inflation does not necessarily just mean a rise in prices. It means a sustained rise in prices, and that it permeates the economy, not just in wages, but in the prices of goods, in the price of utility services, and the like. I don't know whether we're going to have a serious inflation bout, but I do have a fair amount of confidence at this point with respect to the Federal Reserve policy, where interest rates are extraordinarily low, so there's ammunition that they could use. The question is, will they overshoot? And that's what the debate is, about whether or not they might raise interest rates too quickly and then force us into a deep recession. But I think this is still very much a painting in progress, and I would tell people who are extraordinarily worried about inflation to take a deep breath and let's just see how things pan out over the next month or so to figure out whether or not this is a sustained change in demand, leading to real rises in prices.